Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to talk about here is the luck of Henry Clay, a wicked war, civil disobedience, a tall stranger, and what you can get with $25 million. Because we're going to talk about what kind of America do you want. There's the outline for the lecture that's about to follow, and let's go ahead and jump right in. What kind of America do you want? Do you want Jefferson's peaceful land of small and medium farms where everyone lives as close to nature as possible? Do you want Hamilton's urban vision of commerce, wealth, and power? What kind of America do you want to live in? And all of it is dealing with that question right up there. I'm not going to read it, but I'm not going to read it this time. But basically, I'm asking you to talk about Hamilton's view of America, Jefferson's view of America, what presidents are trying to follow which ones, and how well they are doing it. When we left off with our story, we are in the middle of the second party system, the Whigs versus the Democrats. The Democrats who do not want a national army, but are slowly growing to like the idea. The Whigs, who are all in favor of an army. The Democrats, who like weak governments, except when they don't. And the Whigs, who want strong government, but can't ever get one. The Democrats, who completely oppose the Bank of the United States, even though they kind of need it. And then the Whigs, who are all in favor of the Bank of the United States, even when it's incredibly corrupt. Slavery is its own thing that we'll deal with in just a bit. The Democrats who are into territorial expansion, even if it means war to get it. The Whigs who are not into it and don't want it. Internal works, yes. For the Whigs, yes. No for the Democrats. And it's characterized by those really powerful men over there on the left, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun, who still looks incredibly angry. Andrew Jackson is no longer president, but just because he's no longer president doesn't mean he's not going to exert a lot of influence on the Democratic Party. In fact, he does. But I want to ask you this one question. We talked about Andrew Jackson last time. Nullification, the bank war, the Indian Removal Act, and especially in terms of nullification and the force bill. And I want you to kind of pause for a moment, even pause the video, and think about, did Andrew Jackson uphold or betray the ideals of Thomas Jefferson? Going way back to what Thomas Jefferson wanted. Andrew Jackson started the Democratic Party because he thought that the Democratic Republicans were deviating too far from the vision of Thomas Jefferson. Did Andrew Jackson uphold the vision of Thomas Jefferson, or did he oppose it? I want you to think about this, and in about 5 sentences, explain why or why not in your notes, because I might ask you to do it on a quiz. In fact, I probably will. Now, we left off with Sam Houston. Sam Houston beat a man with a cane in Washington, D.C. He was found guilty. He skipped out on his wife, too. And GTT left for Texas. He shows up in Texas just in time to have the Texas Revolution break out. I'm not going to follow the events of the Texas Revolution. I'm not going to talk about Alamo. I'm not going to talk about Goliad. But I am going to talk about the Battle of San Jacinto, where with their backs to the wall, the Texican army turns and attacks Santa Anna's army, and in 18 minutes completely rout the Mexican army, capture the dictator of Mexico, Santa Anna himself, and force him to sign the Treaty of Velasco. There's a very famous painting about the aftermath of San Jacinto. Sam Houston was shot in the ankle. That's with him lying on the ground and Santa Anna standing above him. So it's a really interesting art piece because usually in military art, the defeated are on the ground and the victors are standing. But in this art piece, it's really interesting. The victor is on the ground, but the defeated is standing over him. It's really interesting. Anyway, Mexico signs the Treaty of Velasco, admitting Texas's independence. And then Sam Houston turns and offers Texas to the United States in the last days of the Jackson presidency and into the early days of the presidency of Martin Van Buren. And they'd say no. The United States says no. The Whigs are completely opposed to the admission of Texas. Absolutely. They say, no, we are not going to admit Texas into the United States. And Jackson himself is very sympathetic to the Texans, but offers no real help. And again, just like we did with the Jackson question, I want you to kind of pause and write this question in your notes. Why do you think the Whigs refuse Texas's admission into the Union? Why didn't the Jackson administration help his old protege, Sam Houston? Would have solved a lot of problems later on if they would have just accepted Texas in 1836, but they didn't. And Texas is going to be forced to struggle as an independent republic for the next 12 years. It's going to be a really rough time for Texas. They have no real friends. They have no money. And within the year, Mexico will declare that the Treaty of Velasco is invalid. They will break the treaty. And over the course of that 12 years, Mexico actually invades Texas several times. And Texas never really knows any peace during this period. Martin Van Buren, the handpicked successor to Andrew Jackson, becomes president in 1836, just in time to be present during one of the most dramatic economic collapses in American history, the Panic of 1837. Now, what caused the Panic of 1837? The Panic of 1837 was caused by a run on the banks, which had lent out excessive amounts of credit, and in the middle of a very unstable currency, which was fluctuating between paper money and Martin Van Buren, who was following a hard currency policy of only gold or silver coins. And Martin Van Buren's response to the Panic of 1837 is completely inept. He sticks to this hard money currency, hard money, reliance on hard money, gold, despite the fact that there's not enough of it. And his adherence to hard currency just makes the paper money fluctuate even more wildly. If only Martin Van Buren would have had a strong economic force, some kind of institution that could stabilize the national currency, that could lend out massive amounts of money and keep these at-risk banks afloat enough to pay out the money that people that it owed people. But of course, you can tell that the Second Bank of the United States is dead. And here's the real twist on the Second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson said the bank is corrupt. The bank picks winners and losers. The bank bails out the rich and powerful at the expense of the poor and vulnerable. Andrew Jackson was absolutely correct. Henry Clay said, no, we have to save the bank. The bank is vital to the economy and the currency. We need a powerful bank to maintain currency so that it doesn't spiral out of control. We need a strong central bank to make sure that all of the state banks remain solvent. Henry Clay is also correct. And that's the irony of the debate over the bank war. They were both correct. The bank was corrupt, but it also was a necessary, needed institution. And the Panic of 1837 and Martin Van Buren's complete inability to address the economic concerns utterly devastate his presidency. Martin Van Buren is mocked. He's blamed for the Panic of 1837. He's blamed for the inept government response to the Panic of 1837. And he becomes known as Martin Van Ruin. And the irony is it's really Andrew Jackson's fault. I mean, it really is. Now we advance to 1840. Martin Van Buren is running for re-election, but come on, man. Everybody hates Martin Van Buren. He's completely blamed. And Henry Clay has already lost the presidency twice. He's lost it in 1824 and he's lost it in 1832. He decides, okay, this time everything is lining up for the Whigs. We have an unpopular Democratic president. Henry Clay manages to talk the other hero of the War of 1812, William Henry Harrison, into running for president. You know, Tippecanoe, the guy who won the Battle of Tippecanoe. And people are like, what was Tippecanoe again? And then once they're reminded what Tippecanoe was, then they're like, oh yeah, we like that guy. And to lock it in, they even recruit this sort of heretic Democrat from the South. And his name is John Tyler. And John Tyler is a Southern Democrat. He opposed Andrew Jackson during the nullification crisis. So Andrew Jackson kicked him out of the party. And John Tyler agrees to run with William Henry Harrison on the Whig ticket of 1840. And they win. And their slogan, they borrow all of these techniques from the Democrats. Their slogan is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And against the crippled Martin Van Buren, Benjamin Harris wins in a landslide. Look at that map on the left. Everything is yellow is a Whig vote. It's a wash. The Democrats finally lose an election to the Whigs. And Henry Clay goes to William Henry Harrison, and he says, okay, President Harrison. And President Harrison is like, it's great to be president. And he's like, we're going to build the American system together. And William Henry Harrison is like, yes. He's like, we're going to create a banking system. And President Harrison says, yes. And Henry Clay is like, we're going to do this together, me and you. And then Benjamin Harris drops dead. He's only president for 31 days. And this causes a constitutional crisis because, again, this is one of the little strange problems with the Constitution that nobody ever worked out because it never had happened before. A president had never really died in office. So they didn't know what to do. So everybody's trying to figure out what to do. And John Tyler just up and declares that he is the president. He takes the oath of office, he moves into the White House, and he just starts acting as the president. And everyone just kind of rolls with it. Okay, John Tyler is president. And if a president dies, then the vice president becomes the president. Okay. And later they'll amend the Constitution to make this official. And then Henry Clay then goes to John Tyler and explains everything, the deal he had with Harrison. And he says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to be Whigs. We're going to develop the country. We're going to build the American system, roads, canals, bridges. We're going to create a nation of commerce. Just you and me, Tyler. Are you ready for it? And John Tyler says, no, we're not going to do any of that. And John Tyler then proceeds to become a Democratic president. He proceeds to adhere to all of the factors of Thomas Jefferson. He basically becomes a president straight out of the mold of Andrew Jackson. He favors rural areas. He's opposed to a banking system. He's not into internal improvements. And poor Henry Clay is apoplectic. We finally got a Whig presidency, and the Whig president turns out to be a Democrat. Because John Tyler actually wants to rejoin the Democratic Party. And Henry Clay kicks him out of the Whig Party. So John Tyler has two firsts to his name. One, he's the first vice president to actually become president on the death of his predecessor. And two, he becomes the first president to be kicked out of his own political party. The Whigs expel John Tyler, and they begin to describe him in very nasty terms. They call him the executive ass, or his accidency. And the bitterness of the Whigs towards John Tyler is just palpable. Whenever John Tyler walks into a room with a bunch of Whig politicians, you could just hear their teeth just grind together. He was supposed to be the one great hope, and he stole it away from them. The problem is that the Democrats don't really want Tyler either. So Tyler, as he comes to the end of 1844, begins to realize that no political party will have him. And he's kind of liberated by this knowledge. And he decides, well, his political future is over. He's not going to be president after 1844. And then he basically does the one thing that requires a truly courageous man to do, or a man who knows he has no political future. He embraces the statehood of Texas. And by a deft maneuver inside the Congress, Texas is admitted into the United States in 1844. But the problem is, who is going to be the Democratic candidate in 1844? It's not going to be Tyler. Martin Van Buren really wants to run for president again. Martin Van Buren is like, I was a good president. It's not my fault that the Panic of 1837 ruined my presidency. And Martin Van Buren kind of scares away a lot of other candidates who want to be on the Democratic ticket in 1844. And eventually it comes down to ancient old Andrew Jackson sitting on his, sitting in his bed, because he can barely move in the last few years of his life, in the Hermitage, his plantation in Tennessee. And one of the leading politicians, one of the leading Democratic politicians, go to Andrew Jackson. And this is James Polk. And James Polk pitches this. He's like, look, Martin Van Buren is scaring away everyone else who's going to run. We don't want John Tyler. Who do you think should be on the Democratic ticket in 1844? And Andrew Jackson starts to ask a series of really penetrating questions to James Polk. And halfway through the conversation, James Polk realizes Andrew Jackson is interviewing him for the presidency. And James Polk agrees, and they slip him in what is known as a dark horse candidate, which is a guy who's running for the presidency, but is pretends he's not, and attempts to sort of slip his way through the process. And it is successful. In 1844, James K. Polk runs as president. Young Hickory is what they call him, the protege of Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay is very disappointed at what happened in 1840. So, 1844, Henry Clay decides if something has to be done right, you should do it yourself. And Henry Clay launches on his third and final attempt at becoming president. And he's thinking, who is James K. Polk? Nobody knows who this guy is. He's not really known outside of Tennessee. Henry Clay is absolutely convinced he's going to win the presidency. And then he is deeply and truly shocked when he is beaten by James K. Polk. And you can see the election results right over there. Loyal Kentucky went for Henry Clay, and Polk even lost his own state of Tennessee, but it doesn't matter. A firm sweep of the South and a firm sweep of the upstate confirmed James Polk becomes president of the United States. Henry Clay's bitterness cannot even be measured. Henry Clay begins to realize he will never become president. But before we leave the election of 1844, and I even have a note to myself not to forget the little sliver of the Liberty Party, I want you to look at the popular vote right over there. You know, the blue is the Democrats, the sort of yellow is the Whigs, but there's a little tiny white sliver. 2% of the popular vote went for something called the Liberty Party, a third party. And again, third parties are not unknown in American political history. They don't tend to be very long-lived. They tend to be single issue parties that will push their issue until their issue is accepted by one of the big parties. And there's been third parties before. The anti-Masonic Party, the Know-Nothings, my favorite, the Loco-Focos. But the Liberty Party is different. The Liberty Party is very, very different. And that 2% that voted for the Liberty Party tells us something about American society in 1844, because the Liberty Party is a single issue party. and their issue is abolition. They're supporting candidate James Burney, and James Burney is a firm abolitionist. He argues for the ending of American slavery, for the freedom for the enslaved African Americans across the South, arguing that these people are brothers, they are fellow Americans, and what is being done to them is intensely cruel, unchristian, and anti-American. And 2% of the American population agrees with him. So we have some measure of how popular firm abolition is in the United States. Around 2%. 2%. It's not much, but it's something. And it is posited that without the Liberty Party, the election would have gone to Henry Clay. But enough people are willing to take a stand against slavery in a presidential election to start altering the outcome. Abolition has long had moral suasion. Starting with the Liberty Party, 1844, abolitionists start to exercise real political power. And watch that 2% over the next section, over this next bit of the lecture, because that 2% is going to start growing. Now, James K. Polk. James K. Polk is a very young president. He's a very unusual fellow, and he is unusually devoted to his wife, Sarah Polk. And he's been described as the hardest working president ever. He rarely slept. He often worked 18, 19, 20 hours at a stretch. James K. Polk vowed to only serve a single term and not seek re-election. And James K. Polk is a driven man. He is a very driven man. James K. Polk decides he's going to fix all of the problems left over from Andrew Jackson. And these consist of 4 main points. 1, to establish an independent treasury so that the panic of 1837 doesn't occur again. But it means you also don't have a corrupt Bank of the United States. In other words, James K. Polk is going to fix the central banking question. He is successful. The independent treasury established by James K. Polk divides federal money among several state banks, but then it imposes a set of very firm rules on those banks, and it operates independently of the internal politics of Washington. James K. Polk's treasury is so successful, it lasts from the presidency of James K. Polk, 1844, it lasts until 1928. It's going to last 80 years, and it's going to keep the American economy on track. Not invulnerable and not impenetrable to panics, but on track. The bank wars are over. 2, to resolve all those tariff issues left over from Andrew Jackson. How high should the tariff be? How low should these taxes be? And he settles on a fairly low tax that is able to both protect the North and allow the South to sell cotton on the open market. And everyone is kind of happy with James Polk's tariff. The South is not threatening any nullification, and the North is okay with these tariff issues as well. Again, this tariff issue, which has gone back all the way, to the days of Thomas Jefferson, has been resolved by James K. Polk. 3, he's going to finally fix that northern border with Canada. And he does this. His Secretary of State is James Buchanan, by the way. And he sits down with these British officials. They extend this line left over from the old Adamonis Treaty. And Oregon is simply divided in half. The southern half of the Oregon Territory becomes part of the United States. The northern half of the Oregon Territory becomes part of Canada, part of the British Empire, with the exception of Vancouver Island. And from the Oregon Territory, of course, is going to be carved out the states of Washington and Oregon. Again, this amazing diplomatic solution that had riled people for the last 10 years, solved by James K. Polk. But then comes the 4th issue. And this is what This is what everybody kind of judges James Polk very harshly for. To resolve Texas, but in resolving Texas, he also wants to acquire California and New Mexico from the stricken Republic of Mexico to the south, which is basically owes the United States a tremendous amount of money. It owes the United States $5 million. And James K. Polk thinks it's very easy. We're going to resolve the Texas issue. I'm just going to forgive Mexico their debt, maybe pay them a little more money, and I'll get California and New Mexico, because he's a Democrat, and the Democrats are in to territorial expansion. And he's unusually devoted to Sarah Polk. In fact, he invites Sarah Polk in on cabinet meetings. And James and Sarah Polk at times are operating like co-presidents. The problem is what happened between 1836 and 1844. In 1836, Mexico signs the Treaty of Velasco and recognizes Texas independence. Santa Anna goes back to Mexico, where the Mexicans promptly blame him for losing the Texas Rebellion, kick Santa Anna out of Mexico, and then the Republic of Mexico repudiates the Treaty of Velasco. It refuses to accept the independence of Texas, which is why Texas should have been admitted way back in 1836. And the Mexican army invades Texas several times. They occupy San Antonio. They march up and down the coast. They occupy Corpus Christi several times. They never make any big push to conquer Texas itself. But Texas and Mexico are in an undeclared state of war almost the entire time, between 1836 and 1844. As well as Texas is at war with the Comanche up on the Llano Estacado. At any rate, John Tyler accepts Texas in as a state, and then Tyler's done. He's off. He goes to live in Virginia, where he won't reappear until the Civil War. But the problem is that because Mexico does not recognize Texas's independence, it means there is no set border between the United States and Mexico. And indeed, Mexico says again and again and again, the admission of Texas into the United States means war with Mexico. And they are constantly threatening the United States with war. And James Polk wants to do two things. He wants to acquire California and New Mexico. And his attempts to buy them are just rebuffed. He says, oh, I'll give you $10 million and I'll forgive your debt. Mexicans refuse. He attempts to resolve the southern border with Texas. Mexicans refuse. James Polk comes to the conclusion that war is the only way to resolve the issue. But he doesn't want to be able to fire the first shot. So what he imagines is he will march an army into southern Texas. If the Mexicans oppose him, then it's war. And he's imagining a short, sharp little war that's going to result in a treaty. And in the course of that treaty, then he'll buy California, New Mexico. And that's not at all what James K. Polk got. What James Polk got is this massive war, far larger than anything he imagined, with complications and implications that are going to stretch over the next 100 years. So James Polk assembles the American army, moves it south. But the problem is that he doesn't want to make a war hero because all of the generals are Whigs. They're members of the Whig Party. And under Zachary Taylor, the American army moves to the south. And they build a fort on the northern side of the Rio Grande. Then they are attacked by the Mexican army. And James Polk uses this attack to argue for a declaration of war against Mexico. And it's a very bitter debate over this declaration of war. Only a handful of congressmen oppose the declaration of war, but it does look like the Americans were attacked. So war is declared. Orders are sent to Zachary Taylor to move his army south and to engage in offensive operations to crush the army that's in northern Mexico. And this is the launch of the Mexican War. The Mexican War will be fought in 4 different areas. California, New Mexico itself, Texas and northern Mexico, and then the final invasion of central Mexico. But this one's going to come later. General Zachary Taylor moves the army into northern Mexico. And this is going exactly to James Polk's plan. The Mexican army comes north. Zachary Taylor attacks it at the Battle of Monterrey, wins. The Mexicans are overwhelmed and fall back. And then Zachary Taylor occupies Monterrey. He braces himself for a Mexican counterattack. The army comes north, and on February 23rd, 1847, there is the Mexican counterattack at the Battle of Buena Vista, which Zachary Taylor almost loses, but his army stays solid and repels the Mexican army. And this is the point where James K. Polk expects Mexico to negotiate. Okay, you just fought these 3 huge battles. You lost all 3 of them. We've occupied a major city in Mexico, which is the city of Monterrey. We've already seized California. There were a few minor battles in California, but for the most part, it surrendered without firing a shot. New Mexico itself did surrender without firing a shot. You've lost the war, Mexico. Now it's time to negotiate. Mexico absolutely refuses to negotiate. And Polk cannot find anyone to negotiate with. He finally contacts Santa Anna, who's in exile, and he agrees to smuggle Santa Anna into Mexico in return for peace negotiations. And in return, Santa Anna betrays him, and Santa Anna simply sets himself up as the Mexican dictator one more time, and then promptly announced that this is war to the death with the United States. And in fact, it's Santa Anna who commands at the Battle of Buena Vista. Now, one thing before we leave the Battle of Buena Vista. At Buena Vista, there is an army, he's a captain, and his name is Sam Grant. But that's what everybody calls him. His real name is Ulysses S. Grant. He's a graduate of West Point. He's not a very distinguished soldier. But during the maneuvers, U.S. Grant watches Zachary Taylor constantly. He learns all about the positioning of artillery. He learns about how to take a fortified position. He learns how to build a defensive line. That for U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, the battles in northern Mexico become a training ground in the brutal art of war. And U.S. Grant is going to learn these lessons. And what he learns is going to be employed, but in a way that Grant will never expect. The Whigs are absolutely opposed to the war, especially since Mexico will not negotiate. Opposition to the war becomes widespread, and it includes very prominent and very influential politicians. It's not a few fringe congressmen. These are heavy hitters that come out in opposition to the war. That guy right up above me, that's John Quincy Adams, this ancient guy who was president and defeated by Andrew Jackson back in 1828. He's in Congress, and John Quincy Adams gives speech after speech after speech against this illegal war. That's what he calls it. This illegal war, this war of aggression, this war expended to conquer for more slavery and more slave states. And Quincy Adams is just devastating in his analysis and his resistance to the war. And as the war drags on and as the casualties mount, resistance to the war begins to build as Mexico refuses to negotiate. There is something called the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso is issued by a representative named Wilmot, and he basically says, okay, John Quincy Adams says this is a war to extend slavery. James Polk says this is not a war to extend slavery. So Wilmot says, okay, let's make that a law. The Wilmot Proviso is a law that's passed by Congress that says no areas conquered from Mexico can be used for the purposes of slavery. And the Wilmot Proviso erupts in the Senate. Southerners are outraged about any attack on slavery. And James Polk is caught in an absolute bind. This is why the Wilmot Proviso is such a brilliant piece of legislation. If Polk opposes the proviso, then he'll alienate his supporters in the South, his pro-slavery supporters. If he supports the proviso, those same allies will turn against him because they want more slave states in the West. And Polk is in complete political checkmate. He can't do anything against the Wilmot Proviso. And resistance begins to spread. One of the people that comes out in opposition to the war is Henry Clay, ancient old Henry Clay, bitter, 3-time candidate for the presidency. And Henry Clay views this as a wicked, unjust war. It's an un-American war. He can't believe this is happening. And now we have to talk about Henry Clay's really sad personal life. Henry Clay had a really tragic personal life. He and his wife have 11 children. 9 of them die. All of his daughters die young, or they die as infants. And almost all of his sons die young. And the sons that do make it to adulthood, one of them I think gets kicked by a horse and it like crushes his skull. And he basically spends the rest of his days as like a simpleton in a lunatic asylum. Another one of his sons becomes an alcoholic and damages his brain through alcohol and basically just kind of becomes this very simple subsistence farmer. Like really tragic, like really, really tragic. But there's one son that is the apple of Henry Clay's eye, and that's his third oldest son, Henry Clay Jr. Henry Clay Jr. is young, he's strong, he's intelligent, he's ambitious, he's a powerful orator. He is able to get elected to Congress. He's a congressman. And he goes to his father and this is how I'm imagining the scene. Henry Clay says, "You're the apple of my eye. You are going to be my successor. I could never be president, but you are going to be the great Whig president." And Henry Clay Jr. says, "That's fine. Yes, but I've resigned from Congress." And Henry Clay asks, "Why?" And Henry Clay Jr., his son, the only sort of really great and promising son, says, "My country is at war and it's time to serve my country. I'm going to sign up. I'm going to enlist and go fight in Mexico." And Henry Clay is just aghast at this. He's like, "This is a wicked war of aggression. This is a horrible thing. Why would you do it?" And Henry Clay Jr. says, "Because it's my country and my country has sounded the trumpet and I'm going to answer my country. I'm going to get in a uniform and fight for my country." And Henry Clay does it. He's killed at the Battle of Buena Vista. And Henry Clay is devastated. Henry Clay never recovers from the death of Henry Clay Jr. And he is just a broken man after this. He just goes back. He just goes back to Kentucky. He goes back to his plantation. He buries his son. He goes to Lexington and he gives this like very sad speech. I thought about including it in this lecture and I was like, nah, this is too sad. This is just too sad. He gives this really sad speech against the war. And then he goes back to his plantation, to him thinking to spend the rest of his days, breeding horses, because he's got no children anymore, and waiting for death where he can go to heaven and be with the children that God took from him. And while he's at his plantation in Kentucky, he's visited. He receives a visitor. There's a knock. The butler comes in and says, "Mr. Clay, you have a visitor. He said he saw your speech in Lexington, and he's a newly elected member of Congress, and he would like to speak to you about, how Congress works and how Washington works." And Henry Clay Henry Clay agrees. And this very odd-looking, tall stranger, the guy's 6'4", comes in to meet Henry Clay and introduces himself as the newly elected congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln sits down, and he and Henry Clay talk all afternoon about Washington, about the war, about the Democrats, about slavery. And this meeting has more impact on Abraham Lincoln than any other meeting ever will. And Abraham Lincoln is struck by the fact that Henry Clay is very sad that he has no one to carry on his legacy. And that's when Abraham Lincoln makes the decision. He will carry forth the legacy of this sad old man who is mourning the loss of his son.